this is the book I feel I have it in me to write. And there's so much documented that's never been pulled together, which is not just the making of the film, but the influence of the film, why the film looks so unusual, why it's an art house film that was made to cash in on a band before they split up and actually was the beginning of something rather than the end of something.
We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. I'm Eric Senich. If you'd like to support the podcast, get episodes commercial free, sign up for the Backstage Pass from Patreon. It's just $5 a month. The link in the show notes, or you can go to bookedonrock.com. Now, our guest, Samira Ahmed, is the author of A Hard Day's Night, part of the British Film Institute's Film Classics series. The book examines one of the most influential music films ever made, A Hard Day's Night, released in July of 1964 at the height of Beatlemania. The film was directed by Richard Lester and followed John, Paul, George, and Ringo through a fictionalized 36 hours in their lives as they traveled to London for a television appearance. What could have been a simple pop star vehicle became a groundbreaking film that helped redefine music movies, influenced the modern music video, and captured a rapidly changing Britain in the mid-1960s. Samira's book explores not only how the film was made, but why its reputation has continued to grow more than 60 years later. Samira, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for such a beautiful description of what I was trying to do in that book. So thank you. Sounds like maybe I pulled it off. I don't know.
Oh, you did. A fascinating read. And for you, there's so much that we can get into from your aspect here. You've watched A Hard Day's Night as an 11-year-old discovering the Beatles, as a broadcaster, as a film critic, and as someone fighting a landmark equal pay case. So talk about this film's importance to you and what convinced you that you had something new to say about this film.
Well, like you hinted, I first discovered the film as an 11-year-old. The BBC broadcast all 6 of the Beatles films, the feature films, and the Shea Stadium documentary and the Let It Be film, all of those, at Christmas 1979. And my family were early adopters, and we had a Betamax video recorder, and my elder brother taped all the films off TV. And I discovered the Beatles through those films, particularly A Hard Day's Night and Help, I think, and to some extent Yellow Submarine. And I used to come home from school every day, and I used to put one of these films on. So I probably watched A Hard Day's Night once a week for a really long time. So it's possible I may have watched it more than most people on the planet. And as I grew older, I'd always loved the Beatles. And about 3 years ago, I discovered the earliest complete concert recording they'd made in the UK, the so-called Stow tape, where they played a boys' private school and a student recorded the whole concert. So it's in really good quality. There's not screaming all over it. And he shared the tape with me 3 years ago. And that story went around the world. And it was about the social history. It wasn't just about the music being brilliant or the band. It was about why did the Beatles resonate? What was going on in Britain at that time? And people got in touch to say, even though they didn't particularly regard themselves as Beatles fans, they really connected with that story. So I thought a lot about A Hard Day's Night. And I had been on, there's a great podcast called I'm the Egg Pod here, which I had been on talking about the album and the film. And I realized I had more to say. When I discovered the BFI series hadn't covered this book, to some extent I was surprised, but I was also relieved because I thought this is the book I feel I have it in me to write. And I actually pitched it and wrote it really quickly because I did lots of research, but there's so much documented that's never been pulled together, which is not just the making of the film, but as you say, the influence of the film, why the film looks so unusual, why it's an art house film that was made to cash in on a band before they split up and actually was the beginning of something rather than the end of something. So all that's gone into it. And I've had lovely feedback from people, a lot of people who knew the Beatles in the 60s actually, and said that they felt they'd learned stuff from it, which is all you could ask for, isn't it?
Oh, sure. Yeah. You describe A Hard Day's Night as a snapshot of Britain in 1964. What aspects of British society does it capture better than most history books?
Well, for the first thing, I think it just gives you a sense of how weird it was with Beatlemania. There had been, like Sinatra in America, there had been pop stars who had fanatic followings in the UK before. But there was something about the Beatles and the way they connected with all generations. There wasn't a lot of pop music television. So they weren't on mainstream light entertainment variety shows like Morecambe and Wise with comedians and things. It's equivalent to them going on the Ed Sullivan Show. And the hysteria just continued to grow around them. So what you see in this film is it captures the way that they couldn't go anywhere without screaming fans just appearing from anywhere. It captures that sense of them on television as a medium which kind of transmitted them to the world. I mean, the cover of the book is a spoof of it's a play on the film poster. So instead of being a contact sheet, it's the Beatles split into 4 TV sets. And I like the idea they're a kind of contagion being transmitted to the world. So the world of television and how powerful a force it was in people's lives is all captured in this film. And of course, there's this changing social picture of Britain. We had, although it's, you glimpse it rather than it's made a big point of, it's a multiracial audience. There are teenage girls of colour and teenage boys of colour in that audience, because the so-called Windrush generation of Commonwealth immigrants, like my parents, came to Britain in 1960 from India and Pakistan, they were, very much changing the picture of Britain. And the other thing about Britain at the time is the changing economic picture of work. So there are a lot of interesting career women in this film. And I know a lot of women who became makeup artists in the 60s. Television, the screen world is a big growing place. And women were starting to make their impact in all kinds of ways. So all of that is captured incidentally in the background to a film, which looks documentary style, even though it's a scripted film. There is a mixture of, I've described it as a fantasy documentary, Eric. There are moments that are real, those fans screaming on the street. Some of them were paid to turn up, but a lot of them turned up just because they heard the Beatles were filming. So everything feels, you're not quite sure where the reality stops and the surreality of Richard Lester's comedy style begins,
Richard Lester, let's talk about him, because he's often described as the film's secret weapon. What did he bring to the project that maybe another director might not have?
Well, to start with, he's kind of an outsider. He's an American who had made his home in Britain and loved British humour. And he had a very strong anti-deferential sense. So when the Suez Crisis happened, he was one of those people who thought, who are these idiots who are ruling us? He goes on to make a film like How I Won the War, which is scathingly anti-war and anti the kind of political forces that send young men to die. And his sense of humour just gelled with the Beatles, who watched a lot of television, knew the comedy of a particular couple of actors, Peter Sellers, who's known very much in America, Spike Milligan, who's less well known. The two of them were in a comedy troupe called The Goons, which began on radio. People like King Charles grew up a huge fan of it. The Beatles used to listen to that, and it transposed to television. Some of these actors wrote TV series and films, and Richard Lester had worked with them on a lot of these projects. So they had a shared sense of humour, I think, and he brought that surreality. And also, it wasn't that he knew the Beatles, but he had a strong sense. I read some lovely interviews with Richard Lester of his heart being in sync with a young audience. He was about 10 years older than them, but he kind of came up with lots of creative ideas about how to film them, how to capture them, how to turn the surreality of some of those crazy press conferences, like the one at JFK when they first arrived in the US, when they're being asked about their haircuts and stuff. And they just bat back these inane questions from journalists. And he found a way of turning that into surreal moments where, if you watch the press conference scene in A Hard Day's Night, they're giving answers that don't quite make sense because he kind of mixes up the answers and the questions. At one point, Paul's being asked, how do you feel about your father? And he goes, oh, not really, we're just good friends, which makes no sense at all.
So I was wondering about that, yeah.
Yeah, he films things that could have just been done dead straight as a kind of pop art collage. And that sense of a comedy surrealism, which isn't about big laughs, but it's about playfulness. That's what really makes this film stand out, I think.
And Richard Lester had other writers in mind, including some of Britain's biggest sitcom talents. What did Alan Owen bring that those writers might not have?
It's a great question. So Richard Lester did know a lot of the comedy writers at the time. And Alan Owen, well, he was from Liverpool. He's originally Welsh, but, Liverpool was his home. And I think one of the things this film captures very well is the sense of the way that Liverpudlians talk. They have their own code. They're very, very witty. And it's something George Harrison has gone on to say that, everyone in Liverpool is very, in his view, is very sharp-tongued and sharp-witted. And so if you watch that film, even I, as an English-speaking person, don't get all the lines and all the jokes because it moves so fast and they're speaking in their own idiom. But Alan Owen makes it feel authentic as a result, and he's writing dialogue for them that's obviously not necessarily what they would have said, but he kind of plays with what their real personae were like. So John Lennon is the kind of, sharp-mouthed kind of quipster. Ringo's a bit more laconic. Paul is a bit more eager to please. And while subsequently the Beatles in real life might have felt that they were slightly stereotyped by the version of themselves in this film, I like the idea of there being a version of the Beatles that's a fictional version of themselves. And Alan Owen did a great job at capturing that. And some of the situations he puts them in, I just thought were really like the press conference scene. He wrote scenes during the filming, so they saw how the Beatles responded. So the film was shot more or less in order. And as they gained in confidence, they realised George was actually a really good actor. He had a real presence. He was very laid back. And they wrote that extra scene for him in the ad agency. They wrote the scene for him where he's giving their roadie a shave and using the mirror in the bathroom. Just little moments like that. So there's a sense of the film is responding in real time to what the Beatles are offering up as they go along.
One of the great Beatles stories, Ringo accidentally inventing the phrase "A Hard Day's Night." The film's producer, Walter Shenson, needed a title song almost overnight. And by the next morning, John and Paul had delivered "A Hard Day's Night." And the detail that the lyrics were written on a birthday card for Julian Lennon. That's another great one. Did you uncover any other small human moments like that, which made these larger than life figures feel more relatable?
Yeah, well, I mean, that is such a great one, isn't it? Because one of the things I felt quite moved by was the fact that the real life, the fact that John was married, that he had a 1-year-old son. These facts were kind of kept out of the script, even though it wasn't an official secret that he was married. I thought it was a shame that the reality of the women's lives around the Beatles was sort of kept out of it. One of the stories that I mean, I didn't realize, but it was out there if you went looking for it, was that John Lennon's real father had turned up during the shooting of this film. This is the father who'd abandoned the family, disappeared off to America, and suddenly turns up after years at the theatre where they're filming, the concert sequences, and there's crowds of people trying to get in. And if you remember the film, of course, there's a scene in which the grandfather is trying to get back into the theatre and trying to say, I'm Paul's grandfather. And the real guy who's saying, I'm John's dad, turns up.
Wow.
And the message got through to John that your father's turned up. And he said, in no polite terms to get lost. They did subsequently arrange for him to have a meeting with him. But I just what a strange and just, upsetting thing to happen in the middle of all that chaos, I thought. There were moments like that. And then things like some of the people who were just on the periphery of this. So there's a photographer called David Hearn who had covered the Hungarian uprising. He'd been in places of real danger. And he said he was freaked out by the hysteria that the fans created around the Beatles. He'd never seen anything like it. They used to play Monopoly with them on the train while they were filming. I was fascinated by that even a war photographer was deeply disturbed about the scale of Beatlemania. I thought that was quite interesting.
Yeah, I've heard some Beatle experts talk about that PTSD that all four members must have had in the years following the breakup or the end of the Beatles, because it took a while for them to get out of that phase and be comfortable in their own skin and in their own careers. That Can't Buy Me Love sequence is classic. It's such a great representation of youth, breaking free from authority and tradition. It's still there when you watch it. Probably the most iconic of all the scenes from the film. You call it the most complex in the entire film. What makes it so much more sophisticated than it first appears?
Well, I love that it's actually shot in 3 different locations, weeks apart, because, you just assume that it's just all in the editing. But the scene where they come out on the fire escape and they go, we're out, that's one location. That's the Hammersmith Odeon in West London, as it was, an old cinema. And then they run down that fire escape. And then when they're running across the field, that was shot in Isleworth near Heathrow Airport. In fact, a community group got in touch with them. They did a screening of the film in those same playing fields just the other weekend to mark, Paul McCartney's birthday, which was lovely because the playing fields are still a place you can visit. I've been there. But the other location is Gatwick Airport, London's second airport. And they basically had a helicopter. And if you think about it, when they first seem to run into the field, they suddenly, you're very aware that it's a juddery shot. It's the helicopter going up. And that's where they were shot from a distance, running around, larking in the field. And what's interesting is that was, in a way, the first part of the sequence that was shot. But the cameraman was an experienced military cameraman who'd shot a lot in planes. He'd shot air raids over Germany and stuff for Winston Churchill. And the footage was sent to number 10 Downing Street for him to monitor what was going on. So he'd gone up with a helicopter. And when he got up, he realized that the battery in the camera was run down. So the footage was running through at low speed. So when you played it back at normal speed, it had that speeded up silent movie slapstick effect. So they shot the rest of the stuff kind of to match it. So Richard Lester was very good at responding to an accident and saying, well, let's make this a feature, because he loved Buster Keaton. There's a whole sequence, a chase sequence later with the policeman, which is based on Cops, the 1922 Buster Keaton film. So they shoot the stuff at in the playing field later, and they mock up a version of the helipad, so it looks like it's the same location. And they speed up the footage. But those are 3 different locations shot weeks apart. And at one point, John Lennon isn't even there because they used to film, despite the fact that they all had other commitments. And John Lennon went off to a literary luncheon for his first book. And so there's moments when they seem to be doing like a do-si-do on the helipad, and the camera is being held by what you assume is John, and he points the camera down at his feet in his Beatle boots. That's Richard Lester. So sometimes he substitutes himself for the missing Beatle. So you wouldn't know any of this unless you went looking for the information. And I read a lot of interviews that he'd done with people like Steven Soderbergh, accounts he'd given at previous screenings, because Richard Lester is very much still alive, but just very frail, and he still lives in England. And I think more than anything, I wanted this book to be a homage to him as an American who made Britain his home. And together with the American producers of this film, I love that it took a trio of Americans to give the Beatles back to Britain and the world as the most exciting new British phenomenon.
How much of A Hard Day's Night owes its magic to accidents, like you mentioned, like the sped up film effect, only because the camera battery is running low, and that Richard Lester was smart enough to keep? I mean, how much of the movie has those moments?
A lot has it. And I think one of the best of those moments is within the first 2 or 3 seconds of the opening film, when you suddenly start with that chord of the opening track, and you see through the Beatles are running down that alley next to Marylebone Station, and George trips over and falls flat, hard on his face. Ringo lands on top of him. They get up and they keep running, and that happens a couple of times, things like that. In that whole sequence, there's a lot of fans falling over quite badly in the crush. So you have that sense there's real peril, there's real jeopardy. If they hadn't got up and run again, would they be able to shoot that sequence? Everything's shot as fast as it can be, because they never know when the police are going to shut down shooting, as they sometimes did. They said the crowds are too big, or the crowd might get out of control. And, they had a moment after the first day's shooting on the train where the young technician who was carrying the cans of film looked a bit like a Beatle, and he started being chased by girls, and he tried to outrun them, and he dropped a load of the film, and they had to abandon some of the tape that got lost. So the whole film has a sense of urgency about it. And there's another moment when they're rehearsing a number in the studio, when George leans on his amp, and it kind of starts to almost fall off its stand, and you actually hear the thump of it. So I think all that adds to a sense of authenticity, doesn't it? That he left all these accidents in. Maybe
that's why it stands up so well over time as well, because there are those real moments. You suggest that A Hard Day's Night helped create the modern music video. When people talk about the birth of MTV, modern music video, does the Can't Buy Me Love sequence deserve to be at that center of the conversation?
I think it does. And in fact, even before that, the very first pop video, I'd argue, is when they're on the train and they go into that guard's carriage and they're playing cards, and the music starts up of I Should Have Known Better, I think it is, isn't it? And if you watch that sequence, it's the first time in cinema that you start to hear the song before you see them singing or performing it. And then it suddenly jump cuts to them in the same seats, but they're playing instruments. We take it for granted that pop videos work this way. No one had ever done this before. It's all in the editing, the way that Paul even looks like he's miming along or jiggling his head to hearing the song on the radio, and the next moment he's singing it out loud. And then the Can't Buy Me Love sequence is the kind of, it's arguably the inspiration for the Monkees. I mean, the whole TV show spins out of these running, zany foursome of guys playing around in a field. In a slapstick way. There's a huge amount of slapstick in 60s pop music cinema, even before the MTV comes along. And I find it quite ironic, Eric, that MTV has basically been shutting down across Europe. It's very much in retreat, and that this film has outlived the art form that it invented. I mean, they famously gave him a Vanguard Award in 1984 as the father of the pop video, and he jokingly demanded a paternity test. But he's outlived his child.
Yeah,
I think, and the other one I'd point out, looking ahead a bit, because I look at the other films that they made, and including Help, which was their follow-up with Richard Lester. Those films all shot the pop music treatments in that film in the studio with the cigarette smoke sort of filtered through blue lights, or they're in the Bahamas with these beautiful girls, all again shot through beautiful sunlight. I mean, that anticipates all the Duran Duran exotic videos of the 1980s, like Rio, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Samira Ahmed is the author of A Hard Day's Night, part of the British Film Institute's Film Classics series. David Janssen plays the young truant who meets Ringo during one of the film's most memorable sequences. What insights did he share about working with the Beatles and Richard Lester?
Oh, it was such a joy to talk to David Janssen, who you realise is one of the few members of the original cast who's still around, because he was 10 years old at the time, and now he's in his 70s. And one of the things is he was quite an experienced actor. He'd been in the stage production of Oliver for about a year, and he'd done a lot of television. So he turned up with his own clothes on the shoot. He hadn't realised that Ringo was incredibly hungover. it comes straight from an all-nighter. I love the way the Beatles, we talk about burning the candle at both ends, and they did that a lot. So they cut back a lot of the dialogue that they'd scripted for Ringo. I mean, the dialogue was written to be learned in short bursts. They didn't expect the Beatles to be learning pages and pages. They would learn it on the day, do the scene, move on to the next scene. So they cut that right back. And he described beautifully to me the way that they improvised with fiddling with the camera. They're walking alongside each other, which wasn't the original plan. The original plan was they stood and looked at each other and talked to each other. But the reason that scene still works is something very modern, isn't there? About two men who can't quite communicate. And so it's like driving along next door to each other in a car, isn't it? And you talk to your son without looking at him, and you can share things if you're not looking at each other in the eye. I also love the fact that there's something very poetic about Ringo essentially encountering his childhood self, because he had in real life played truant as a child on the shores of the River Mersey, as captured in the lyrics to the song Glass Onion. So there are all these echoes underneath, whether you know or didn't know this stuff, that comes into that. And I don't want to spoil it because I want people to read the book. I was shocked to realize David Jansen that he was supposed to be in another scene later on in the film. And that's one of the, possibly the only error of judgment, I would argue, that Richard Lester made, which was failing to have that return of his character, which would have had a lovely symmetry to it when he was supposed to turn up again. And David explained how and why it was that he wasn't included in that scene.
You suggest that Victor Spinetti's frantic TV director was inspired by the BBC producer that Lester observed that day. Talk about that and how much of A Hard Day's Night is rooted in those real moments that he witnessed firsthand.
Oh, yeah. So there's such a lovely role, isn't there? Victor Spinetti, he plays this very uptight, concerned director who doesn't really understand pop music, but is very, very anxious about it all going horribly wrong and the band not turning up. Richard Lester said two things. One was that it was supposed to be a sort of exaggerated version of himself, because Richard Lester had spent 10 years in television. He directed hundreds and hundreds of live TV shows. A lot of the mistakes, like Grandfather Coming Up Through the Trapdoor, was stuff that he'd witnessed. So he was working in all these jokes about how television works. When Richard Lester got the job and was definitively going to be working on the film, he went along to see the Beatles in action and meet them. And it was at a theatre in London where they were supposed to be rehearsing for a show. And there was complete chaos. And the Beatles turned up late. They were very good humoured through it all the way that they always were. But the director of this TV special, was the BBC director, was absolutely frantic and tearing his hair out with kind of anxiety. So when Richard Lester witnessed all that, he thought, this is all part of the story, isn't it? That everyone around them is kind of caught up in the anxiety of it. And one of the things I subsequently found, which I quote in the book, is there were a lot of other TV shows that they did, and there was a great TV appearance they'd done in 1963. Again, it was a live show, which is what the scene in this is supposed to be. It's supposed to be a live broadcast concert on television. And the director of it had to write a big explanation to the head of his department about why it had been such a disaster, because no one could hear anybody else. The Beatles were singing out of tune because they couldn't hear themselves over the screaming. The cameras were always on the wrong shot because they didn't have any direction because they couldn't hear the director. And so I love the fact that this film, in a sense, is an artifice, because when the concert happens, like spoiler alert, the concert goes beautifully. But of course, when they shot these sequences for the feature film, the Beatles were actually miming in a theatre full of screaming fans rather than playing live. So there is an artifice in conveying the controlled chaos of it. And I like that, in the end, the film looks good because Richard Lester knew when to fake stuff and when to do stuff for real. And I did interview two of the girls who were in that concert sequence, screaming along. So that was quite insightful as well.
He's the most valuable player, I think, here of all the decisions he's made and the things that he did to make this movie stand up so well over time.
Yeah, and I particularly appreciated, I think one of the biggest things that I learned was how he had made this film so successful by using television techniques. So in live TV, you have multiple cameras on the act and you cut between them live from the director's booth. In cinema, usually, you have maybe one or two cameras, and in those is probably just one, and you shoot the same sequence repeatedly. And instead, he just got all the best cameramen he could. At the time, there was a lull in the British film industry. They got the top camera operators in the UK. And they just, because they knew they wouldn't be able to hear anything of the screaming, they said, just shoot and shoot and shoot when the Beatles are playing, whatever you like. And then they composed the whole film in the edit. So part of the frenzy of that concert sequence is sometimes you see a camera and it starts like it's on Ringo's face and it suddenly zooms at high speed across the theatre to catch, and it jiggles around looking for a place to land. And those were not moves that were shot to be included in the edit. They were shot just to find the next good thing. And then the idea is that, you then, but Richard Lester thought, no, I can use some of that. That gives, so, you know, he uses the stuff that you're not supposed to see to help convey the energy. And again, we take it for granted now. We have all those reality style comedy shows like The Office, where, you know, there's a camera crew and that pulls the focus, or it zooms around to catch someone just off the edge. I mean, Richard Lester arguably invented all those formats. There's a sitcom feel to this that is 50 years ahead of its time.
Wow, never even thought about that as well. Yeah. So you argue that the story of women in A Hard Day's Night is much richer than the stereotype of just screaming girls. What do modern audiences miss when they reduce Beatlemania to that single image?
Well, for a start, they're patronizing. And I think it's very interesting that whenever pop bands or pop stars have big female fan followings, they're always dismissed. So David Bowie's teenage girls are often excluded from the story of his fame. They're a huge part of his story. And in fact, I made a documentary about them called I Dressed Ziggy Stardust, which pointed out that, you know, a lot of his early fans were the teenage girls who influenced his dress and so on. And the Beatles as well, everything was just reduced to, oh, those screaming girls. Now, they're obviously a big part of it, but one thing, and the photographs, my book is full of photographs, there are a lot of boys in the audience screaming along too, which I think is interesting. But if you look at the world that the Beatles moved through, you know, through the TV studio and through the news conference and in the hotels and so on, and the nightclubs where they try to escape, they're encountering adult women of their own generation or a little bit older, sophisticated city women who are in nightclubs with their boyfriends or working in an advertising agency or assistant directors. And I like the idea of it capturing this changing world of work where women's opportunities were opening up in a big way. And of course, it started to be reflected in the Beatles songwriting, where they're encountering, you know, rather than just writing those songs which were written to a kind of 50s formula, a bit Brill Building style about, you know, I want to hold your hand and she loves you. They start to write songs like You Won't See Me or Norwegian Wood, I once had a girl, or should I say she once had me. You know, songs which are more about women who aren't at the beck and call of their men. And I feel all that transition is going on in this film. And I love that I was able to identify one of the girls in the nightclub who's a really famous fashion designer in Britain called Adina Ronay. And she's in the scene where she's got long blonde hair and she's drinking a glass of wine. John Lennon's talking to her and she's sitting with what's presumably her boyfriend. And if you look carefully, her lovely leather-booted leg is erotically cupped by her boyfriend, who's holding her foot in his hand while they chat. It's such a love little, and that's one of the photographs I put in the book. And I loved just taking the time to revel in actually what interesting women characters are in this film. They're not in it for very long. And there's Anna Quayle, the theatrical figure that John Lennon bumps into in the theatre, who goes, thinks she knows him, but she can't quite place him. You know, these lovely little cameos, they're so rich, aren't they? And they give you a sense of, there's so much more to it. The one thing that I think is a shame, and it's not, you know, Richard Lester was deliberately being sexist, but I think it's a shame that schoolgirls on the train were a little bit, you know, finger in mouth like toddlers. And I know that, you know, George met his wife, Pattie Boyd, you know, and so there's a lovely meet cute there. But I thought it was a shame that's kind of image that I think is dated a little bit. And similarly, there's a woman in the nightclub who, incidentally, is the Bond girl that you see in the title sequence to Goldfinger, with all the title sequences projected onto her bikini-clad body, Margaret Nolan. But she plays a kind of comedy, big busted, you know, woman in the casino who has no lines of dialogue. And I think some of those, that's to do with the script. I mean, there was a whole scene that was cut, Eric, which was quite sexist. And, you know, I think on the whole, they had a good eye for, not they, but the producers around them had a good eye for what would and wouldn't work. The film, it's not mean-spirited. And the other thing I wanted to mention is there was a whole scene that was written for Ringo, which was quite racist. It would have had him going into a shop, and I've got the original script, and talked about a, quote, typical Jewish proprietor and trying to make a sale that would fool a load of black sailors. And the Beatles never got to see that scene. I mean, the producer Bud Ornstein just saw it and just said, no way, that's racist. And so, you know, there were some really good instincts in the decision makers around the Beatles, as well as they themselves being, of course, very passionately anti-racist, which meant this film has not dated in the ways that a lot of other films have.
That's what I was about to ask, is a lot of 1960s films have aged poorly in terms of race and gender. But maybe those decisions are why it's largely avoided that fate.
I think there's two factors. I think one factor is that Brian Epstein, like a lot of managers at the time, wanted to keep romance plots out of the film. And so it means that you don't have female characters doing, you know, and it's such a big role that they might be then written in a stereotypical way, which I think helps. But the other factor is that I think Richard Lester's background in comedy means that the women in the film are there. Sometimes they're little comedy moments, you know, so the secretary in the advertising agency who's appraising George Harrison for an advertising gig, not quite realizing he's the real thing. You know, it's quite a sophisticated form of comedy, you know, and I think that's what he brought. And if you look at, I mean, there's a great show that Richard Lester made with Spike Milligan called A Show Called Fred. And there was a sequel to it called Son of Fred, made as far back as 1956, so only a year or so after independent television began in the UK, offering some competition to the BBC. And it's astounding how many interesting female characters there are, how surreal it is. It's Peter Sellers is in it as well. It breaks the fourth wall. It's that sense of, you know, women can be just interesting comedy character types rather than stereotypes. And I think that's why this film works in that sense. It doesn't have the dated opinions that were still at large then, you know.
Find the Booked on Rock website at bookedonrock.com. There you can find all the back episodes of the show, the latest episode in video and audio, links to all of the platforms where you can listen to the podcast, plus all the social media platforms. We're on Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and X. Also, check out the Booked on Rock blog, find your local independent bookstore, find out all the latest hot rock book releases, and before you go, check out the Booked on Rock online store. Pick up some Booked on Rock merch. It's all at bookedonrock.com. Reading the letter by BBC TV director Barney Colehan, I think that's the pronunciation, Colehan. It sounds as though Beatlemania created technical problems television simply wasn't prepared for at that time. How did Richard Lester overcome those challenges in A Hard Day's Night?
Well, that's the director I was thinking of when I talked earlier about how they shot the concert sequences. Very practically, Richard Lester knew that although he was trying to create the idea that they're doing a live TV broadcast, he was very practical about how he shot it. So the Beatles mimed those songs repeatedly in that theatre. They shot over the course of a whole day with that crowd. Richard Lester moved that audience around. So although there's the stalls and there are two circles and balconies, he either filled the stalls or he filled the upper circles. And if you watch the film carefully, you can see moments where one section is actually black, like it's blacked out and it's not lit. So the emphasis is somewhere else. So he took the time over the course of a day to capture what looked like a live gig, but shot it really carefully. And I think that's the key. A
young Phil Collins, one of the children in the audience during the concert filming. Did you uncover any interesting stories about Phil's day on a Hard Day's Night that maybe did make it into the book?
No, I mean, Phil Collins had narrated some of the DVD extras for A Hard Day's Night on its 50th anniversary release, I think, or even earlier. So I'd watched that back. He actually, I don't think, has many memories of the day other than just being overwhelmed. The other future pop star who, of course, was in the audience was Linda Lewis, who'd been a singer with the likes of David Bowie and stuff as well. So I love that there are two future pop stars in that audience. And then a different kind of musical star, you could argue, is someone I met through social media. Her mother was one in the opera scene. There's a scene where they're rehearsing for a clip from Die Fledermaus by Strauss, and the grandfather suddenly comes up through the trapdoor in it. And they'd recruited these singers from the Royal College of Music in central London, and someone had just gone around the canteen and said, "Do you want to be in this film? They're shooting at Twickenham Studios. It's £10. It's quite a lot of money." And they all had to learn a few bars of Die Fledermaus, and they came and delivered it. And that was one of the lovely stories because this woman said she didn't want to give her name. For some reason, she wanted to not be named in the book. I don't know why. But she talked about going to the canteen. They filmed this at Twickenham Studios with a couple of the other singers. And they were still in their kind of Durandal, sort of German rustic peasant costumes. And they went out to Paul McCartney for an autograph. And of course, Paul McCartney had studied, English literature at A-level, which is the kind of senior school qualification. And he started to quote Tennyson at them. "Do you come from haunts of coot and hern?" Which is quite a famous poem that was widely taught in schools at the time. And she remembered that. And I love these little insights into, they're all, the thing that really comes across about the Beatles is they were all really smart. And Ringo probably had the least schooling of them all, but the other three were all grammar school boys. They were all quick-witted, as you discussed. Ringo came up with this Ringoism of A Hard Day's Night, and he came up with 8 days a week and all these kinds of phrases. So, they were all quick verbally, and they had a huge range of interests and they were interested in classical music and pop music and opera and anything that was going in poetry and all of that, and television and film, and all of those references are they're present, aren't they, in the way that the Beatles interact with each other and with their fans.
That's how they were able to handle the press too. Quick questions, because they had a bunch of questions getting thrown at them, and so they were able to be witty and not be able to say anything that's going to get them in hot water with the exception of, that famous Lennon moment, the bigger than Jesus moment, but otherwise they had those funny comebacks.
Can I just say about that? I mean, I don't know how you feel watching it back. And British journalists could be just as inane, but there was something about the way that American press corps didn't seem to get the Beatles at all and ask such inane questions. And I thought the Beatles were really smart. They didn't just say that's a stupid question. They just battered it back with their quick wit. And I think they made the press fall in love with them because they didn't mock the press exactly, but they laughed at them.
Sure. Yeah. At first they just thought, who are these kids with the strange haircuts from the UK? They didn't know what to think at the time. And yeah, they fell in love with them.
Oh, can I mention one other thing? Just as an American insight. So the future Olivia Harrison, of course, was a teenager in California at the time this film came out. I had interviewed her at the launch of the Beatles 64 documentary, which came out a couple of years ago on Disney+. And she talked about the importance of the Beatles' hair, which is, of course, captured in such glory in this film, up close a lot of the time. But she said how, being a high school teenager, you never saw hair like that. Everyone had the preppy look or they were sporty jocks, and that it was a real shocking thing to see young men with such lovely hair, and that it freaked out a lot of American men, both teenage boys themselves and their dads. I don't know what your memories are.
I mean,
if your father has told you.
Right. I was going to say it's before my time, but sure. Yeah. I remember.
Sorry, I wasn't implying you with that at all. Sorry.
No, that's okay. My mom and dad talked about that, how, that was kind of, it was a culture shock. It wasn't something anybody had been prepared for. But what's interesting here about in the States is during that time, it was like this welcomed relief or outlet for teenagers here in the States after the John F. Kennedy assassination. That's what, my parents have talked about and other people from that generation, like, man, kids needed somewhere to release all that pent up sadness and frustrations over the changing times, and it was like they just came along at just the right time.
Yeah, and I'm fascinated by the fact that the Beatles had signed the contract to make this film in October 1963, but by the time they start shooting it in March 1964, they've already been on Ed Sullivan, and they have become the biggest band in the world. And somehow they're still shooting on the streets of London without any big security or anything, And as I mentioned, once or twice the police would turn up and say, no, I'm sorry, you're not allowed to shoot on the street today because it's dangerous. And they would improvise. They'd go inside the theatre, and they shot the press conference sequence a couple of days earlier than planned, just improvising. And they managed to ring up people to come play it, being the journalists, and roped in journalists who turned up to watch the shoot. But the fact that the Beatles are already the biggest thing in the world, and they're shooting a film just on the streets. And also, crucially, they're still enjoying it. They're not, even though they are trapped by the fame, the joy they have when they're performing for each other.
You're right.
And even when they're running from the crowds, the way that they laugh and they look at each other, you can tell it's still joyful for them. And I think within a year, that's all changed, hasn't it?
Within a year, a couple of years, yeah, then it just becomes just unbearable. Like they stopped touring because they didn't feel anybody was taking their music seriously. Just screaming fans wherever they played, and that's why they stopped touring. But John later admitted that the band was worried that their old friends from Liverpool might think they'd sold out. But despite all those worries, 200,000 people turned out for the Liverpool reception. Was that the moment that the Beatles realized they hadn't lost Liverpool after all?
Yeah, I think that's a really astute observation. They were more worried about going to Liverpool for the Northern premiere than they were about the original world premiere in front of Princess Margaret in London. Because being from Liverpool, going back home and being, they were worried, as I quote John in the book, saying that, that they had somehow they'd become too clean, they'd kind of sold out in a way. And he's argued that we sort of had. And there's great news footage, the original newsreel footage that was shot by Granada Television is available at the BFI archives. I went and watched a lot of this footage, and you can tell they're just so touched by the crowd. There's two great stories, one of which is, of course, John doing one of his notorious Hitler salutes, not because I think he was, thinking of himself as Hitler any more than he thought of himself as Jesus Christ. But I mean, partly it was just a trope at the time. All British schoolboys were obsessed with World War II, but also there's something about the adulation of these crowds. And I think he's got a kind of ironic distance from it. Like, why are these so many hundreds of thousands of people turning up to wave at me? It's in madness. But the other story that I've learned since writing the book, so it might go into second edition, is Michael Palin, of course, was a very good friend of George Harrison. George Harrison was a big supporter of the Pythons. I mean, that's part of the subsequent story of A Hard Day's Night is, how they all went on to pursue film in different ways. And I didn't realize that George Harrison had stolen the truncheon belonging to the chief police constable of Merseyside Police on that Northern premiere in Liverpool. And he kept it all those years. And at some point in the 1980s, I was reading Michael Palin's diaries from that decade quite recently. And one day for his birthday, George Harrison just gave him the truncheon that he'd stolen from the premiere. He was quite a rule breaker, was George. People think it was John, but I think George is the one who's really the most anti-authority. And I love that he just lifted the truncheon and kept it as a souvenir.
We know they captured the minds and hearts of the youth in the UK and the States, but what's interesting is that many older critics were pleasantly surprised by the film. Why did A Hard Day's Night win over so many reviewers who might have been expected to dismiss a Beatles movie? Yeah,
that really surprised me. I went through all the old press cuttings, and almost universally, with the exception of the Financial Times reviewer and ironically Sight and Sound, which is the kind of cineasts magazine, people loved them. And I think it was partly, a lot of these reviewers were relatively speaking middle-aged. They were probably in their late 30s or 40s. They hadn't known what to expect. And they were charmed by the fact that the Beatles were really interesting, charismatic people. I mean, like Elvis, this is one of the biggest things that emerges from watching the Beatles on film. They have a natural charisma and charm. And I know Elvis's films weren't all that good, but he's always watchable and he's always wonderful in everything, as far as I'm concerned. The Beatles were like that. They were themselves, and they had a warmth that just came through the camera. And these critics got to work out, like they would say in the reviews, I can tell them apart now. They noticed how much comedy came naturally to them. They made comparisons to the Marx Brothers or Buster Keaton or Charlie Chaplin. This was high praise at a time when those filmmakers were highly regarded. And even in Germany, where, the Spiegel magazine, which, you thought, how did it cope with it in translation? They talked about it as a treat for cineasts. So I think they surprised everyone. And they also, particularly their magnetism. I mean, there's an animal sexuality, even though it's slightly diluted by the comedy that surrounds them in this film. Some of the critics are comparing them to other British pop stars. There's a pop star called Cliff Richard, whose musicality was quite an influence on them. Hank Marvin and guitar playing in his band The Shadows was a big influence on the guitar playing of the Beatles. He'd been considered a big heartthrob up until this point, but he suddenly looks like nothing compared to the energy of the Beatles, and that's he was
supposed to be the next big thing, Cliff Richards, I believe, and until the Beatles came along.
I know, and I don't know what you made of that section in the book, because he never made it in America.
No,
although
did.
He made a couple of big films that had very much an American audience in mind, particularly Summer Holiday, which was the second film that came out a year before A Hard Day's Night. But it was ironic that those films were made to an American formula to try and break through in America, and they don't work. Whereas the film that the Beatles make, A Hard Day's Night, is deliberately a black and white. It's an art house film. It looks like the French Nouvelle Vague. It doesn't quite make sense. There's no love interest. It breaks all the rules. They don't even speak in, recognizable Southern English, posh English. The Americans who saw the first screening of it at Billy Wilder's house said, "You're going to redub this, surely." And they didn't. If you didn't understand it, well, you just got carried along by their charm. I mean, these are all reasons why the film has endured, because it dared to be completely original, and originality is always what endures, isn't it?
Yeah, maybe that's why. Did you end the book by observing that while we grow older, the Beatles, A Hard Day's Night, never do?
I know,
and why do you think those four young men still what do you think they have to say to audiences in 2026?
I think they speak of the joy of camaraderie and friendship, of sticking up for each other, about living in the moment, and about celebrating doing what you do really well. They were great musicians, and that songwriting, that sense of the performance of doing their music to the best of their abilities, that's hugely inspiring to us all, isn't it?
Final question. If you could sit down with John, Paul, George, and Ringo today, ask them one question about A Hard Day's Night, what would it be?
Oh, it's tricky, because I have sat down with Paul McCartney. I interviewed him for a couple of hours for his book launch. And the thing is, I don't know how much they would remember, because it was a period of a few weeks in the whirl of their life. I suppose I would argue is if they watch the film again, how do they feel about it now? Because I think at the time, they liked it. They wanted to make more films, but over the time, I think they worried that it caught them in in aspic in a way. This the cliche of the sort of the mop tops, and of course they moved on so quickly from that. So I'd like them to watch it afresh and then tell me, now can you see why this film has endured?
Thanks so much for checking out the Booked on Rock podcast. If you've just found the podcast, welcome. If you've been listening, thank you so much for your support. And make sure you tell a friend, a family member, share on social media, and let people know about Booked on Rock. And if you do like the podcast, make sure you subscribe, give a 5-star review wherever you listen to the Booked on Rock podcast. We're on Amazon, Apple, iHeart, Spotify, Spreaker, TuneIn, and on YouTube Music. You can check out the full episodes on video, along with video highlights from episodes on the Booked on Rock YouTube channel. Find it at Booked on Rock. Thanks again for listening. Now back to the show. The book is titled A Hard Day's Night. It's part of the British Film Institute's Film Classics series. It's out now. Find it wherever books are sold. Look for it at your nearest bookstore. Go to bookedonrock.com to find your nearest independent bookstore. Where can people find you online, Samira?
I've got a blog called samiraahmed.blog. I should say I'm not the same Samira Ahmed as a great Chicago-based writer, Samira Ahmed, who's a young adult writer, but she's a friend of mine. So just so you know,
Okay.
I like her and I've interviewed her. She's brilliant. But she wrote books like This Book Won't Burn and Hollow Fires, but she's a different Samira Ahmed to me. We often get each other's emails, which is quite entertaining. But and I'm also on Blue Sky and X at Samira Ahmed UK. And I should say there's also an audio book of this, which you might enjoy. All
right. Well, as usual, I always put the links to all of those in the show notes so people can find you and reach out to you. And
can I mention one other thing?
Oh, absolutely.
Which is I have a podcast called Through the Square Window, where every month, me and my co-host, we look at vintage TV shows from a month and a year. So we did 1987 recently. We looked at Moonlighting, for example.
Oh my God, I have to subscribe.
A bit like with this book, you look through something from the past through the prism of what was going on at the time, what's the social history moment, but also how does it look today? Can we see the start of something, or do we see something that has dated and is obsolete like a dinosaur?
Okay. I'm literally subscribing right now before I let you go. What's the name of it again?
Through the Square Window.
Through the Square Window. I am a TV fanatic. Are we talking about, is it Moonlighting with Bruce Willis? Are we talking about?
Yeah, Bruce Willis and Sybil Shepherd.
Watch it every week with my dad. That was a must watch.
We looked at the first episode of Twin Peaks, for example. My God, that show holds up.
Oh, fantastic. Okay. I'm subscribing, always looking for new podcasts. Okay, great. Samira, thank you. Fantastic book. I hope you do a sequel. If you do, come back on. We'll talk about it.
I will. I would love to. And thank you so much for having me on. It's a real thrill.
That's it. It's in the books.